It was our moonshot of the early 1900s. This was something we did. The French had failed, and we were able to lick disease and technological problems and financial difficulties, and we had the spirit, the morale to go forward when others would not have. So we were charged up with the fact that this was a real can-do American achievement. And here people were going to give that away.
Definitely they had something in back of their minds when they set the policy of invasion. And my feeling definitely is that they do want to stay past the year 2000, both militarily and economically involved in Panama. And probably we will see in the short term the interest of the United States in some sort of review of the canal treaties.
In 1977, the United States and Panama signed treaties designed to end what has been called the last vestige of U.S. colonialism. At the end of this century, the United States will relinquish control of the Panama Canal. For Panamanians, the canal has long been a reminder of U.S. domination, a reminder of their position as tenants in their own country. Hello, I'm Edwin Newman. The canal treaties meant better relations between the United States and Panama, at least for a while. But all that changed when Manuel Noriega, once a useful player in U.S. foreign policy, became public enemy number one. For the United States, the dictatorship of Noriega and the invasion that ended it dramatized the painful process of giving up the canal. Panama City, a city like any in the United States. Crowded streets, fast food, big business. A city built with American dollars. A major investment that United States officials say required protection. Protection from the menace of communism, protection from the fervent nationalism of Panamanians, and from the corruption of General Manuel Noriega. The United States invasion of Panama on December 20th, 1989 brought about the downfall of Noriega, but it also renewed charges of U.S. imperialism and raised questions about whether Panama would ever be able to govern itself and the canal. The Panama Canal symbolizes the paradox that is Panama, a country both proud of its special relationship with the United States and ashamed of its dependence on the superpower. The canal has long been a source of pride for the United States. Since its opening in 1914, the canal has signified the glory of U.S. technology. The canal was a magnificent engineering feat, a task only Yankee ingenuity could complete. The U.S. succeeded where the French had failed. The United States started work on the canal in 1904 and doggedly conquered the rains, jungles, and mosquitoes that had driven the French out of Panama only a few years earlier. As a result, the United States philosophy of "we built it, it's ours" influenced all canal treaty negotiations with Panama. From 1903 to 1977, canal treaties granted the United States in perpetuity the right to maintain its own city-state inside the country, the Panama Canal Zone, a 10-mile strip of land bordering both sides of the canal, over which Panama had no jurisdiction. As the canal grew in economic importance, Panamanian resentment intensified, finally erupting in major protests in 1959 and 1964. On Panama's Independence Day in 1959, students tried to raise their flag in the canal zone. Riots broke out. U.S. troops intervened. But the Panamanians had gained ground. President Eisenhower agreed to let the Panamanian flag fly in the area of the canal zone known as the Shaler Triangle. 5 years later, the Panamanian flag was again at the center of protest. Panamanian students tried to fly their flag at a zone school. U.S. students resisted. Fighting broke out. U.S. troops and zone police were called in. When it was over, 21 Panamanians and 3 United States soldiers were dead. Following the '64 riots, succeeding U.S. administrations recognized the need to renegotiate the 1903 Canal Treaty, but were unwilling or unable to do so. The idea of giving up the canal seemed sure political suicide. After all, the canal represented the legacy of a powerful America, once the envy of the entire world.
Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Organization of American States, where we will witness the signing of two historic documents, the Panama Canal Treaty and the treaty concerning the permanent neutrality and operation of the Panama Canal.
It was not until 1977 that Panama-U.S. relations changed significantly. The administration of Jimmy Carter struck a deal with Panamanian leader General Omar Torrijos. Panama was gradually to become the landlord, the United States its tenant.
The very treaty itself represented a step so large that Carter's predecessors were unwilling to take, a recognition that a treaty that lasted in perpetuity was unjust in the modern world.
Robert Pastor was the National Security Council's Latin American point man during the Carter administration.
I don't think there is any question that the United States gained enormously as a result of these canal treaties, but they were still very difficult for the American people to accept because it required a wrenching away from a 19th century sentimental interpretation of U.S. relations with small third world countries.
Most Americans thought only Panama profited by the treaties. To many, this was one more example of U.S. weakness, of the U.S. knuckling under to some third-rate, third-world country.
I was called a traitor and his betrayal of my country because I'd undertaken to do this.
Saul Linowitz was a chief negotiator of the 1977 canal treaties. He remembers why people were so opposed to turning over the canal to Panama.
It was our moonshot of the early 1900s. This was something we did. The French had failed, and we were able to lick disease and technological problems and financial difficulties, and we had the spirit, the morale to go forward when others would not have. So we were charged up with the fact that this was a real can-do American achievement. And here people were going to give that away. Take it away from the United States as though we had it, that was the assumption, and give it to this little country called Panama under, as some of them said, a tin-horn dictator who was getting this deal.
Panamanians were not too thrilled with the treaties either. One treaty involved the operation and defense of the canal, the other its permanent neutrality. It was the second that angered many Panamanians.
If any agreement between two nations is to last, it must serve the best interest of both nations. The new treaties do that, and by guaranteeing the neutrality of the Panama Canal, the treaties also serve the best interest of every nation that uses the canal.
The Neutrality Treaty gives the United States the right to defend the canal permanently and to send its warships through at priority status. Without this guarantee, the treaties would not have made it through the Senate. But this same guarantee almost kept the treaties from being approved in Panama. To keep the treaties afloat, Carter and Torrijos issued a joint statement of understanding. It said that defense of the canal did not give the United States the right to intervene in the internal affairs of Panama. It also said that the two countries would jointly defend the canal against any threat to its neutrality.
Those two circles of interest just barely overlapped. Because they barely overlapped, it was very difficult for either nation to reach agreement. Carter and Torrijos found that small overlap between the two circles. It was so small that the treaties were approved in both Panama and the United States by the most minute margin.
Something else about the treaties bothered certain Panamanians. They objected to the treaties being negotiated by a dictator whose charm overshadowed an ugly truth. They believed Torrijos found drugs a ready source of revenue and that the U.S. knew it and chose to look the other way. Carlos Rodriguez was a vice presidential candidate in Panama's 1984 elections.
Carter knew it. He had the intelligence to know that not only was Noriega at that time involved in drug trafficking, but so was Torrijos.
I am not aware of any evidence of either of any drug smuggling whatsoever by either Torrijos or by the National Guard under Torrijos while Jimmy Carter was in office.
Robert Pastor now directs Latin American and Caribbean studies at the Carter Center, a public policy think tank established by Jimmy Carter. Pastor organizes meetings in which Latin officials discuss major problems such as drugs and human rights abuses, two areas that Pastor says were not overlooked in Panama during the Carter years.
I don't think we deliberately downplayed the human rights situation in Panama in order to get ratification of the Canal Treaties. Quite the contrary. We were trying to make clear the importance of the Canal Treaties were in U.S. national interests and that they required the negotiations between two sovereign governments. And whatever we thought of Omar Torrijos or whatever we thought about the human rights situation in Panama, these treaties were still in our interests.
I think there was almost an obsession on the part of the Carter administration to get those treaties signed. I think he had taken enormous political risks here in the United States to do it. I think he had the obsession for very good reasons. But in that obsession, I think he covered up all the human rights violations of the Torrijos regime, all of the drug trafficking and money laundering.
Proof of Torrijos' involvement in drug trafficking and a Carter administration cover-up never materialized. And whatever the problems in Panama during the late 70s, they seemed insignificant compared to those in Nicaragua. The corrupt dictatorship of Anastasio Somoza was collapsing. Waiting to take power were the Sandinistas, young revolutionaries proficient in anti-U.S. rhetoric. Somoza no longer found the U.S. willing to bolster his regime. Instead, the U.S. adopted a policy of non-intervention. Nicaragua would have to work out its own problems. That is, until Ronald Reagan took office. 1981 ushered in a new era of U.S. policy. Ronald Reagan promised to bring back the glory days when the United States was feared and respected around the world.
A weak America kissing the rear end of Latins, diplomats and politicians alike, is not what Latins like or respect. What they really respect is a strong America. They stand up for their interests. Argentines fight for Argentine interests. Chileans fight for Chilean interests. And we ought to fight for American interests. And they don't respect Americans who stand around, as some of, I'm sorry to say, the Carter administration officials did, looking for things to give away.
Nicaragua seemed a perfect place to make good on this promise. The Reagan administration would rid Latin America of the communist Sandinistas and make it safe again for democracy. The rest of Latin America, including Panama, became the backdrop against which the U.S. Sandinista conflict was waged.
At least 85% of the Reagan administration's entire Latin American policy can be called by one name, Nicaragua. And most everything else was subservient to getting money for the Contras.
For the first 6 years under Reagan, Panama was forgotten. But in 1987, it again took center stage. Since the death of Panama's dictator, Omar Torrijos, in 1981, the United States had been supporting the regime of General Manuel Noriega. Whispers of Noriega's corruption were loud and frequent. But the United States took little notice until 1987, when Colonel Roberto Diaz Herrera, a high-ranking officer in the Panamanian Defense Forces, publicly accused Noriega of political murder and drug trafficking. U.S. reaction was mild, mostly tough talk and weak sanctions. But the hand of the Reagan administration was to be forced in early 1988. U.S. Attorney Leon Kellner announced in February that 2 Florida grand juries had indicted Noriega on charges of drug trafficking. The United States did act now, but reluctantly.
It was only after the Senate passed some very, very strong resolutions and after the international press got onto the thing that they were embarrassed into some sort of action.
Roberto Eisenman is publisher of La Prensa, an opposition newspaper shut down while Noriega was in power. Eisenman believes the Reagan administration was not expecting the drug indictments.
I think if the drug indictments were not there, you would still be listening to people in Washington saying, well, there's really no proof. These is allegations, and after all, he is the government, et cetera, which is all the justifications that you normally were hearing before.
Nestor Sanchez was not...
In fact, before the indictments, many in the Reagan administration had been saying just that. But former State Department official Frank McNeil and others, in testimony before the Senate, disputed that claim.
I would point out to you, you may say this is conjecture, but I would point out to you that at that time, statement was made that Panama should be put on the shelf, that Noriega should be put on the shelf until Nicaragua was taken care of.
Frank McNeil is a former ambassador to Costa Rica and former director of the State Department's Bureau of Intelligence and Research. He resigned in 1986 because of a bitter dispute with Elliott Abrams.
I wonder where the Foreign Service digs up creeps like Frank McNeil myself. It was a discredit, I think, to the Foreign Service.
McNeil accused Abrams of blackballing him within the State Department, and all because he told the truth about U.S. policy in Nicaragua.
The obsession by that time with Central America, with Nicaragua in particular, led people to lose their moral compass, I suppose. It was the only way to say it, and to actually help build up Noriega.
There were others who accused Reagan officials of closing their eyes to Noriega's drug dealings.
When you look at the relegation of so many U.S. policy interests around the world to taking a back seat in favor of aiding the Contra operation, then it doesn't surprise one that there would be State Department acquiescence in the drug business in Panama.
You know, Moss's comment is kind of a slur, but it's not a serious policy analysis.
Elliott Abrams, Assistant Secretary of State for Latin American Affairs from 1985 to 88, has been called an anti-diplomat by Frank McNeil. By others, a faithful soldier in the Reagan forces, praised for taking a tough stand in Latin America, blamed for botching U.S. policy in Panama.
The connection between Noriega and Nicaragua was non-existent. I want to repeat that. Non-existent.
Colonel Aristides Hassan is the author of several books on Panama's history. During Noriega's rule, he was also head of the Panamanian side of the Combined Defense Force for the canal.
Ellos querían que Panamá se prestara aquí para entrenar los contras y nosotros inclusive participáramos en la avanzada a atacar Nicaragua. Nosotros dijimos no, eso no es nuestro problema.
Although the degree of Noriega's personal involvement in the Nicaraguan conflict is speculative, Panama's role in U.S. psychological intimidation and intelligence gathering is not.
All right, let's go.
The United States Southern Command, or SOUTHCOM, which is based in Quarry Heights, Panama, oversees U.S. military operations in Latin America south of Mexico. It has 10 military installations in Panama and a force of about 12,000. The relationship between SOUTHCOM and Noriega was a long-standing one.
It's very hard for the U.S. ambassador in Panama to be the U.S. ambassador in Panama. Normally, the head of Southern Command was the person that had access to Noriega, and that's where the relationship was handled.
Noriega was one of many Panamanian military officers trained at the United States School of the Americas. Almost 95% of the Panamanian Defense Forces were trained there. The School of the Americas was moved from Panama to Fort Benning, Georgia in 1984. Its stated purpose has been to make Latin militaries more professional. Critics say its real aim has been to build strong Latin militaries able to wage war against communism. With U.S. training and Noriega's leadership, the Panamanian Defense Forces grew steadily in numbers and strength.
Their training has been acceptable in the past. Of course, they've had the best trainers in the world, which is the United States.
Just how strong and repressive the Panamanian Defense Forces, the PDF, could be became apparent in February of 1988. After Noriega was indicted, Panamanians opposing him took to the streets in protest. They were met by the Dobermans, the PDF riot police.
There is a political crisis in Panama.
The United States responded with threats. At one point in March of 1988, Assistant Secretary of State Abrams said he hoped Noriega would be gone in a matter of days.
There were demonstrations against him every day, general strikes and so forth. And, you know, our feeling was you never should have Americans do something that nationals of the country in question can do for themselves, and they were able to do it, we thought, with a little bit of help. Primarily because of the Pentagon, the Joint Chiefs' opposition. No help was offered.
Noriega had no reason to fear State Department warnings. As early as 1986, some say, he was being reassured by CIA Director William Casey and the U.S. military.
He's reading the body language from CIA and the Defense Department that he need not pay attention to the babbling from the State Department, that the stated policy is for show, and that essentially he, General Noriega, is the favorite of the Director of Central Intelligence and of a number of people in the United States military.
The United States did enforce economic sanctions against Panama in 1988, freezing all Panamanian government assets in the U.S. and blocking all U.S. payments to the Noriega government. But according to Abrams, it was too little, too late.
We never thought that imposing economic sanctions in April, after the crisis began in February, was going to kick Noriega out. The miscalculation that some of us in the State Department made, I am one of them, was that I never dreamed that the administration would sit there for 6 weeks and do nothing, then impose economic sanctions, and then do nothing again.
Like the Reagan administration, the Panamanian opposition had its share of problems. Opposition leaders were divided as to how much of a role the United States should play in solving the crisis. Critics said that while opposition leaders publicly denounced U.S. intervention, privately they wished for it. But Roberto Arosemena of the Popular Action Party says that to be in favor of U.S. intervention is to be for a continued policy of militarism.
Los Estados Unidos de Norteamérica, quien ha promovido el militarismo panameño, lo quiere seguir prohijando, pero con un nuevo comandante.
Here is where Noriega had much of his support. In neighborhoods like San Miguelito, he preached class struggle. On one side were Noriega and the lower classes, on the other, the rich opposition leaders and the United States.
El problema de Panamá son luchas de clases también, luchas de clases sociales. El pueblo del arrabal nuestro, el del concepto de Torrijos, ese es el que existe también. No existe lo que tiene Eichmann millonario, el otro millonario, la clase rica, hay la clase pobre también.
I think the criticism is unfair because every major revolutionary movement in the world has been born in the middle class, including the Soviet Revolution.
Many of the leaders opposed to Noriega were educated in the United States and came from prominent Panamanian families. Guillermo Endara studied law at New York University. He served as a close advisor to Arnulfo Arias, a populist figure who was robbed of his victory in 1984 in elections that U.S. officials knew were rigged but chose to endorse. They feared the anti-U.S. rhetoric of Arias.
Our party, the party of Arnulfo Arias, is 99% popular classes. We have always been that way. We might have a few, 1%, 2% people from professions or from business community, but our great majority is from the popular people.
In Latin America, the Catholic Church has often been an active force for political change. In Nicaragua, Archbishop Obando y Bravo had openly defied the Sandinistas, as he had Somoza before them. Opposition leaders in Panama had hoped for the same in their country, where 95% of the people are Catholic. And the Archbishop of Panama and the church did criticize Noriega for his human rights abuses. The bishops formally demanded he step down. But to some in the opposition, the Archbishop lacked the strength to rally the people and hasten Noriega's departure. Some compared the urbane, cautious Archbishop McGrath to the fiery, outspoken Obando and were disappointed. McGrath himself says the Noriega government saw the church as a thorn in its side. The real problem was that opposition leaders wanted no criticism.
They were hampered by their own lack of unity among themselves. Another factor that we tried to help overcome, we were not very successful, and it turned into criticism, was that the opposition did not develop programs, policies, proposals. It wasn't clear what they're working for.
Just as some within the Panamanian opposition charged the Archbishop with being soft on Noriega, there were those in the United States who questioned the courage of the Panamanian opposition. Panamanians bristled at the suggestion. They contended their non-violent movement was the only way to counteract Noriega's violence. Panamanians faced their greatest test of courage in 1989.
The delegation that went to Panama was received well. They traveled around the country without restraint. And so far as we know, the leaders in the government now have said that they would welcome international observers. So we'll be monitoring the situation closely, hoping that the early indications continue.
On May 7th, 1989, Panamanians went to the polls. It was a showdown that Noriega lost, then won. He lost at the ballot box, but won in the streets. He met nonviolence with violence and cries for democracy with bullets and billy clubs.
But again, the most horrible thing is the feeling is how can they so brutally beat decent people? Forget me. There were ladies there with children you can see on the films. And the hoodlums were protected by the defense forces.
Guillermo Ford was the second vice president for the opposition. The three-party coalition, which by almost everyone's count but Noriega's, won the election. Opposition candidates won about 70% of the vote. No matter, Noriega simply declared the election invalid, and it appeared Noriega would continue to hold on to power despite opposition at home, U.S. sanctions, and 2 coup attempts that failed.
No es un hombre el que tiene a la potencia más grande en jaque. Es la dignidad de América Latina.
There were rumors around that this was some American operation, and I can tell you that is not true.
The attempted coup of October 1989 was the last time the United States decided against direct intervention in Panama. In the early morning hours of December 20th, 1989, 24,000 American soldiers launched their assault against the regime of General Manuel Noriega.
The most you could see the bullets and the lights and, you know, flashing and you're hearing the bullets, but really you couldn't see nobody because the whole place was in darkness, especially this area, because this was the most area that they had any fighting, really.
Samuel Bruce lived in the area near Noriega's headquarters. His home was destroyed during the invasion.
The American soldiers were just talking in Spanish, trying to tell these people to come out of their houses, come out of their houses. But then Noriega was telling them they come out of their houses, that we're going to kill them.
The Panamanian defense forces quickly collapsed, and 14 days after the invasion, Noriega surrendered to the United States. He was flown to Miami to face drug trafficking charges.
This is really a sort of a medieval spectacle, and it goes really far beyond any of the other invasions of the United States in Latin America, even in what we think of as the bad old days of gunboat diplomacy.
Mario Rognoni was a cabinet minister under Noriega and also a close friend. He is one of the few remaining members of Noriega's political party, the Democratic Revolutionary Party.
They just came in and went and did their business with no consideration of human lives, properties, or the dignity of a nation.
In the United States, Representative Charles Rangel was one of a handful of congressional leaders who spoke out against the invasion.
To take United States fighting men, and I say this as a Purple Heart veteran, and to allow them to believe that our national security was threatened is an abuse of presidential power, nothing more.
In Panama, most seemed to welcome U.S. intervention. Fernando Boyd is a periodontist in Panama City and the coordinator of the Civilian Crusade, a coalition that had actively opposed Noriega. Boyd's sentiments are shared by many Panamanians.
The invasion, what is called the invasion of Panama by the U.S. forces, we call it a liberation.
First Vice President Arias Calderon is another who believes that Panama has been liberated.
We were a people that looked down to the ground in fear and with a touch of despair. And now we're a people looking at a horizon of hope and new opportunity.
Others, like Archbishop McGrath, saw the invasion as necessary but unfortunate. The Archbishop worries about what will happen now that the jubilation has died down, the smoke is cleared, and the costs have been counted.
We do have that feeling of being free now. We're beginning to rebuild a democracy, and that's a fact for which we're very grateful. But on the other hand, there is the lingering sense of what an invasion means in itself, and also the precedent it establishes, and also to what extent does an invasion become an occupation, and also to what extent does an invasion offer the opportunity for the much stronger nation to somehow impose its will in larger or smaller things.
Fewer U.S. soldiers patrol the streets now than in the days immediately following the invasion, but the United States military still plays an active role in keeping domestic order. United States military and civilian police work together at all precincts in Panama City. Captain Stephen Lynch of the U.S. 21st Military Company is assigned to the precinct of San Felipe.
Each precinct has special forces and 2 civilian police, and then my military police. And essentially that's pretty much what we've been doing, and it's been working, basically helping to set an example. And we go on combined patrols with each other.
The Panamanian government and the United States argue that U.S. forces are needed to help rebuild the country.
If you look around Latin America, the greatest outside force for democratization and civilian control is us. The work of the U.S. Army, for example, in places like El Salvador has been terrific in building a professional force and in trying with mixed success to teach them how to be non-political the way the U.S. Military is and submissive to civilian control. So I don't think the Panamanians have anything to worry about except the too early withdrawal of American troops.
Government officials in Panama and the United States argue that the police system had been under the iron hand of Noriega and that now it must be rebuilt, and Panama is not capable of accomplishing that task alone. Some Panamanians believe this is a sure sign the United States plans to continue its domination of Panama. Gerardo Gonzalez was a vice president under Omar Torrijos and later a supporter of Manuel Noriega. He represents the Democratic Revolutionary Party in the Panamanian National Assembly.
Y ahora mismo estamos en una situación colonial, donde quienes mandan son los norteamericanos, en todas las dependencias del gobierno y en las instalaciones militares de Panamá, o policiales.
Even those who opposed Noriega fear continued United States domination.
La práctica ha demostrado que en Panamá los Estados Unidos tienen ahora mismo un gravísimo problema. Los panameños también lo tenemos, que es ver en qué manera recuperamos el sentido de destino común, que ahora mismo, después del desastre del 19 de diciembre, se ha perdido mucho la capacidad de autogobernarnos.
But for many Panamanians, the fear of U.S. involvement is not as great as their fear of PDF involvement. The majority of Panamanians serving in the new public force are former members of Noriega's Panamanian Defense Forces.
They are calling it a police force, yet it is being run by military men. A greater concern because those military men were all Noriega supporters at one time or another, were involved in the corrupt process at one time or another.
Mayin Correr is a Panamanian journalist and radio and television talk show host. She was also a member of the Panamanian National Assembly. During Noriega's rule, her family's radio station was closed and she was thrown out of the country. She returned to Panama after the U.S. invasion.
Maybe 80% of the people of this country suffer the military booth on their heads, on their freedom. So it's very difficult. It becomes very difficult for us to accept these same people that were torturing and destroying our lives, killing our people, to be now our guards.
Aristides Valdenado is second in command of the new public force. At one time, he was chief of intelligence for the PDF. Later, he spent 21 months in jail for participating in the March 1988 coup to oust Noriega.
So most of the defense forces personnel did not agree with what Noriega was doing. They were trapped in a system that made them to follow, obliged them to follow orders.
La Prensa has struggled since the invasion to get its paper on the streets. It was shut down by Noriega for its strong criticism of his regime, its equipment all but destroyed. The paper now warns against a possible return to militarism.
I'm afraid of the monolithic command. I'm afraid of one guy with uniform is going to use a radio or a telephone to issue commands that have to be obeyed in the whole republic.
No one could be more keenly aware of Panamanian fears about the public force than First Vice President Ricardo Arias Calderon. It was his decision to include former PDF members in Panama's new police force.
Obviously, we don't want to repeat the past. I spent 21 years fighting dictatorship, and God knows, like many other Panamanians, suffered in my own flesh and in those of my relatives and immediate family, being put out of the country, being jailed, being beaten, being menaced and threatened. And there's no way we want to return to the past. But there's no way we want to live obsessed by the past.
Arias Calderon recently unveiled his plans for structuring the public force. He believes it is safer to involve former PDF members in the new public force than to leave them jobless and isolated.
I think a lot of people are concerned about the public force, and it's normal. They're concerned about the conditions under which dictatorship could again raise its head. But that concern cannot be the only concern. And I'm worried that some people only have that concern in mind. We also have a second concern, not to repeat dictatorship ever again, but also to provide security for our country in full respect for human rights.
The United States has been blamed not only for the military situation in Panama, but for the country's economic mess as well. On almost every downtown street corner, Panamanians stand in line to buy lottery tickets. Their chances of winning seem greater than getting a regular paycheck or keeping a job. Unemployment is running at 35%, more than double what it was in 1986. According to the State Department, United States sanctions played only a small role in the economic chaos. The blame rests with the mismanagement and repression of the Noriega government. But with U.S. investment in Panama reaching $1.5 billion, the economic sanctions were devastating. And because Panama's currency is the United States dollar, the previous government could not print more money to help relieve the crisis. The political turmoil and economic sanctions were even more crippling because Panama has a service economy. It produces little in the way of exports. And much of what Panama does produce, or about 1/3 of its exports, goes to the United States. During the last 3 years of Noriega's rule, Panama's exports to the United States fell by 20%. Panama centers much of its economy on banking. It imposes few regulations and no taxes on banks.
The entire banking sector, which at its heyday, or even up in 1987, was 120 banks, 35 billion in deposits, and over 7,000 high-quality jobs, plus all the multiplier effects out into the economy, that's been wrecked, that's gone. That won't come back.
Panamanian economist Jose Galan is not so pessimistic.
Entonces los bancos se fueron de Panamá cuando había total tranquilidad política, porque ya no era buen negocio estar en Panamá. En este momento, por supuesto que con la situación de crisis, con el cierre bancario, eso ha afectado la imagen, pero el negocio bancario en Panamá no se va a terminar mientras Panamá no cambie la ley bancaria.
Following the United States invasion, Panama's economic situation became more desperate.
And I think what most people in the States haven't realized is how terribly destroyed this country has been by the Noriega regime, by the U.S. sanctions, by the invasion, and by the pillaging afterwards. We're really standing up in ashes to try to rebuild.
Ambler Moss and others are concerned that stability in Panama will require a great deal of economic aid.
It's quite simple. If the United States spends its way out of this invasion with serious money and helps reconstruct Panama, then good things can happen. And if it doesn't, then I stand by my statement that Panama is going to be a wreck of an economy, and there are going to be very serious social problems, and I don't think the present government could last very long under those circumstances. But that really all depends on Washington.
Charles Mackling is a former State Department official and a visiting scholar at the Brookings Institution.
There's no doubt that we owe it to them. We owe it to them in the additional sense that for the year or two preceding the invasion, we thoroughly wrecked the Panamanian economy.
No segment of Panama remained untouched by the U.S. invasion. For the first time in its history, the Panama Canal closed for security reasons. U.S. officials stopped traffic for 24 hours because they feared sabotage. From the beginning of the U.S.-Noriega conflict, the canal had increasingly become a political pawn. Panamanian employees of the canal suffered because of the United States economic sanctions. Under the sanctions, the U.S. withheld the income tax payments of Panamanian canal workers from the Noriega government. That made them delinquent in their taxes. As a result, they could not get license plates for their cars or visas to leave the country. Some had their bank accounts frozen, and some were beaten and jailed without cause. The Noriega government also made no plans for administering the canal after the year 2000. Panamanian canal workers had no guarantees of job security or retirement benefits.
There are some responsibilities that Panama must assume, not just on the 1st of January in the year 2000, but probably in the early 1990s. One aspect would be to give assurances to the Panamanian workers and employees of the canal that their job security will be protected.
United States canal workers, most of whom live in what was once the canal zone, were caught in the middle. The treaty stipulated that police protection of that area would be turned over to the Panamanian government. This was not a problem until the United States and Noriega squared off. In 1989, a group of United States canal workers met with Robert Page, the chairman of the Canal Commission's board of directors. At their town meeting in the Panama Canal Commission Training Center, they presented the results of a survey of United States canal workers. 69% said they would hesitate to call the Panamanian Defense Forces in the event of a problem. 91% said that Panama and the old canal zone should be declared a hardship area. Once a year, members of the Panama Canal Society meet to remember good times. for the 75th anniversary of the canal opening, about 3,200 former employees and their families met in Tampa, Florida. Many remember Panama as paradise. 100-year-old Bob Dill is the oldest member of the Panama Canal Society.
In 1911, a school day friend came by the bank to see me. He was on vacation in Houston. We went out to lunch, and he talked me into going to Panama with him. And when we arrived at Kohls, I never saw so many people, and everyone was so busy that it was a challenge immediately.
Growing up in Panama was wonderful. It is, if the situation in Panama was now as it was when I was growing up, I would be living there presently. It was an atmosphere that you always felt very safe and secure. Everyone knew everybody else, and it was just absolutely wonderful.
For many former Zonians, or Panama Canal workers, like Richard Beale, the 1977 treaties were the beginning of the end of the Garden of Eden.
I guess I shed a tear, too, because I knew it was coming to an end. And very shortly thereafter, I retired, and I left there because I knew it was the situation going to deteriorate.
When Zonians speak of deterioration, the Panama Railroad almost always comes up. Completed in 1855, the world's first transcontinental railroad carried gold prospectors to California. The treaties turned it over to Panama in 1979. Now it is no longer considered safe, partly because of the condition of the train and tracks, partly because of robbers. But safety is a concern only if you can catch the train. You can wait hours for a train that never comes.
To see the train in such shambles in the highways with holes in them that you could almost lose your entire car in one of the holes, these are things that were part of the treaty.
Even today, it's easy to see why the Zonians were reluctant to turn over the canal to Panama. The canal zone offered a way of life they could not find elsewhere. But according to Saul Linowitz, the 1977 treaties recognized that Panama could no longer be a United States colony.
Well, for the people living in the canal zone, it was a wonderful life. They had the advantages of a colonial society. They had their country clubs, they had their own schools, they had their own courts, their own police system. They were really living, as I say, in a colonial manner. And I can understand, and we could at the time, their distress, their disappointment, their objections. But the question was not what would be best for them, but what would be best for the country.
The fact that supertankers cannot negotiate the canal and that there is increased land and rail competition does make the canal less vital than it once was. Most of the canal's technology is 75 years old.
Other countries, oddly enough, have a much greater stake in the canal than we do, such as Japan, such as the West Coast countries of South America, even Colombia, which sits on both oceans, uses the canal as a much, much higher proportion of its GNP than the United States does. So the canal is a useful asset, but not something that presumably one would go to war over anymore.
Perhaps the canal is not of sufficient economic value to go to war over, but it is still of tremendous political value to the United States. Giving up the canal to a friendly government guarantees a strong United States presence in Panama. But for many in this country, giving up the canal to Noriega would have meant that once again Uncle Sam had been brought to his knees by a weak third world country. So the Bush administration, like the Reagan administration before it, believed Noriega had to go. The canal became one reason to invade.
No one believes the Panama Canal was in jeopardy. No one believes that the 1,000 of troops that we put there to protect the canal were in jeopardy by that ragtag remnant of a military force that Noriega had.
The real problem that Noriega posed was to the sensitivity of President Bush. If he hadn't persistently thumbed his nose at him, we wouldn't have had this invasion.
The canal may not have been in any danger, but interim canal administrator Fernando Manfredo believes the invasion was necessary to protect its future.
There was no way Panama could, take over the canal operation and guarantee the efficiency if we had come to the year 2000 with a country that was not living in democracy, the country was not living in peace.
Questions about the future of the canal and the Cabo Torrijos treaties did not disappear with Noriega. Some say the Panamanians may not be capable of running the canal fairly and efficiently.
Many of them are very, very intelligent people, very educated people. But they come from a small country, and they all come from families that can be hurt politically. If they get a job with the canal and somebody over there wants them to buy their product or to do this or to do that, it's too easy for the bad guys to threaten their families and their lives, prevent them from doing the job they have to do.
El segundo problema serio es precisamente cómo no solo no politizar la administración del canal, sino además cómo proyectar esa imagen en términos internacionales.
Others have argued that the real interest of the United States is not in protecting the canal, but in keeping the U.S. military in Panama.
Bueno, los planes de los Estados Unidos nosotros los denunciamos durante todos estos años anteriores, que lo que querían era invadirnos, ocuparnos y convertirnos en una colonia, eso es lo que han logrado. Y perpetuar su presencia militar en este país después del año 2000.
Former Southcom spokesman Ron Sconyers says the United States is committed to fulfilling the treaty obligations. And that means, unless there are negotiations to the contrary, Southcom will be out of Panama by the year 2000.
We will be doing a phased withdrawal between now and the year 2000. Recognizing, however, we don't have to leave until the year 2000. We don't have to make one further move, according to the treaty, between now and then.
Southcom still says its main mission in Panama is to defend the canal. But the U.S. presence in Panama has always been large, in fact, far larger than is necessary to protect the canal. Some Panamanians talk of extending the U.S. military presence beyond the year 2000.
The United States and also other governments, they have positions and they have treaties with other countries to have strategic defenses and balances of power throughout the world. This is very important. I think in Panama could work the same way.
Fernando Manfredo says the idea of renegotiating the treaties and maintaining U.S. involvement in the canal after the year 2000 should be considered, but only if it is clear that Panama is the senior partner, the U.S. the junior.
I would like to have always just as my associate, my best customer. And about 70% of the cargo that goes through the canal either originates or is destined to the U.S. ports. So the biggest customer of the canal is the United States. And I think I would like to keep him with me, as a partner in the business, because I provide the facility, he provides the business.
Other Panamanians would like to see the treaties renegotiated, but for a different reason. The Neutrality Treaty of 1977 states that the U.S., in cooperation with the Panamanian government, will defend the canal. But the Neutrality Treaty puts no time limit on the U.S. right to defend the canal.
Porque también una situación que es incómoda para nosotros los panameños, y es el hecho de que se haya firmado a perpetuidad. Esto no se dice expresamente en el tratado, pero sí queda implícito desde el momento de que no tiene una fecha de terminación.
Despite the fact that this may open the door for possible U.S. intervention, Panamanians like First Vice President Arias Calderon want to see the treaties honored.
I don't foresee in the coming years the need for a renegotiation of the present canal treaties. What I see is a great deal of work to be done to have these treaties implemented fully and faithfully on both sides, but particularly from our side, preparing for growing responsibilities.
Treaty negotiator Saul Linowitz believes the Panama Canal treaties represent U.S. foreign policy as it should be.
I'm very proud of these treaties. I think they, in a way that is very significant, have shown the world the face of America that I like to think is the United States at its best, dealing fairly, thoughtfully, reasonably, wisely in handling a problem in which a small, weak nation is involved.
With Noriega gone, there is optimism that treaty implementation will proceed more smoothly. For the first time in the history of the Panama Canal, the chief administrator is a Panamanian. When the Panama Canal treaties were signed in 1977, no one thought turning over the canal to Panama would be easy. The treaties were born in controversy, and not surprisingly, they have remained at the center of conflict. The canal represents Panama's strong nationalism and its almost century-old struggle to become more independent of the United States. The irony of the recent U.S. military invasion is that while Panama now savors its first taste of democracy, it finds itself increasingly dependent on Washington. Panama must now prove that it is capable of governing itself and the canal, and the United States must prove that it is capable of respecting Panama's sovereignty and of giving up the canal. I'm Edwin Newman. Thank you.
Partial funding for this program was provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.
Video cassettes are available from PBS Video. Call toll-free 800-424-7963.
This is PBS.